I am a fan of Mario and Luigi Brothership, and while it might sound ridiculous to most, it feels like a miracle to me. Because none of this was supposed to happen, Alpha Dream went bankrupt a few years ago, and even when they were still around, the Mario and Luigi series seemed to be at its lowest point. Its last original game was one of the most heavily impacted by the Mario mandates, and while the game still had the gameplay you would expect of the series, the sheer lack of creativity and purpose couldn't be described as anything but disappointing to me. Perhaps the Superstar Saga remake was a clever way to try to bring all the games to the 3DS, but the Bowser's Inside Story remake felt like nothing more than a desperate attempt to appeal to a proven past, all to distract us from a rather directionless future. When you've been online for a while, it feels like you start to understand the cycle of how these things go. When once beneficial patterns end with a whimper, it's usually bad news, and when the content you make is often about overanalyzing and predicting stuff, sometimes what you expect starts to blend in with reality, even when you don't want it to. My expectations rarely feel subverted, and even when Mario and Luigi made a surprise appearance in the June Direct after nearly a decade of no original titles, I couldn't even say I was ready to celebrate. Because even if the series was finally back, I didn't know if, well, it was so back. Now, Mario and Luigi was one of those game series I grew up with, see? I hold it in high regard. The real ones know exactly where my alias comes from, and to me, the series wasn't back just because of a new trailer. Because I've been disappointed before. I know some Alpha Dream employees have been hired by Nintendo, but things were still different. So when the initial reviews came in, I didn't know what to think really. IGN gave it a 5 out of 10, many were saying that the beginning of the game is boring, and while I wanted to hold out hope that it just had a slow start, sometimes it feels naive and like I'm coping to have hope to begin with. I knew that IGN is not exactly a great source for game review scores, but there were still some alarms going off in my head. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to get the game because I didn't want to be disappointed, but I dragged myself to the store anyway because, well, I am a Mario and Luigi fan. I had to know for myself. And the verdict? Well, there's a lot of good and some not so good, but before I tell you if we are truly back, a disclaimer. This review is going to be split into 3 sections in the following order. No spoilers or stuff that is known by anyone who watched trailers and very basic things. Moderate spoilers, which will have no major story spoilers, but it will discuss some game elements for those on the fence. And then finally, full spoilers, where I'll talk about my experience for those who also played. I will try to give valuable perspective to all demographics at the end of each section, but keep in mind, we will eventually hit some spoilery topics. You have been warned, so let's get into it. First off, the rumors are kind of true. The game starts off slower than I had wished, and a lot of it feels like it has to do with design philosophy. These games are entry-level RPGs, and as a result, they want the game to be accessible. And what this means is the devs clearly don't want to put too much on your plate all at once, and they want you to be comfortable with jumping before you get into using a hammer or special attacks. And of course, there are added features in this game outside of battles that require learning as well. Luigi behaves a little bit differently in this game. He jumps automatically in the overworld now when you're platforming, and they do this a lot for puzzle purposes, but I find that sometimes I hate the Luigi AI and wish he just controlled like the other games. I feel like in this game I often am just controlling Mario, and that extends to the battle system too, where the devs have made the absolute criminal choice of forcing you to select your Luigi actions with the A button instead of the B button. I know you guys have probably heard about this already, but I again need to grill them for this. Part of what made Superstar Saga such a hit was the debatably revolutionary concept of just giving each character their own button. Doing it in this new style not only makes the system less intuitive when you immediately have to switch back to the B button for Luigi's action commands, but it also forces anyone who has ever played a prior game in the series to rewire their brain just for this game's battle system, and it's just utterly confusing that they would choose to do this. Now luckily, the tutorials in this game come in the form of quick notices on screen that you can just read. This keeps things moving faster in the early game than Dream Team's notoriously slow and unskippable tutorials. But again, wanting to space these out made the game still start slower than I wished. Back in Bowser's Inside Story, they introduced a system called attack pieces for every area, where you could get a new bros attack for every new area that you traveled. I did not really like this system because it limited the amount of new attacks you got in my mind. Notoriously in Dream Team, it feels like it takes 10 hours just to get some variety in your bros moves, whereas in Partners in Time, the game was handing out cannonballers, a really cool attack, in the first major area. I understand that some of these attacks are quite powerful and proper balancing must be considered, but I vastly prefer the Partners in Time approach in this regard. Brothership does do away with attack pieces, meaning that there weren't really limitations on what attacks could be introduced when, but in spite of that, the game is still content to wait a bit before giving you multiple sets of moves. This means that while the battle system is mostly fine, that there's not really much going for it early on in the game outside of learning the early game enemy attack patterns. I can assure you that there is added complexity that will come into play later, but there is a wait time for getting to it. There is good news though, some of the control changes I actually do like. For instance, hammer buttons on the overworld are now assigned to the X and Y buttons, meaning you don't have to cycle between jump and hammer actions. Additionally, when there are breakable blocks on screen, you can just activate Luigi to act on his own with the L button, and he'll help you out or even do it solo for you. You can even talk to an NPC in some instances where Luigi does some busy work for you, and I find that neat in some instances. Of course, there are more actions outside of just the hammer, but they get added to a wheel in this game toggled by the right control stick, which is also an upgrade over mashing the R button like in some of the older games. I've seen many people complain that some of the earlier areas in the game are boring, and I don't really agree, to be honest. While these areas are simple to an extent, they don't feel particularly bland. Rumbla Island, your first major destination, isn't just a standard grassland level, it's the home of a bunch of artists and craftsmen. And on this island, you're tasked with meeting a specific character and her family. This quest takes you to additional islands and introduces the gameplay loop of the game. A bunch of floating islands were once connected together but have been separated. It is your goal to bring the world you find yourself in back together. I often find that when I start a new RPG, I often struggle to find reasons to really care about the story or its characters. You can kind of tell when a game is trying to ram a certain character down your throat or stress their importance, and it kind of just makes you despise that character sometimes. It is crucial to find a way to make the player seem to care, but it's not always obvious how it should be done. And weirdly, I do think that they do a somewhat decent job here, because there are a lot of characters you meet in the first part of the game, and none really seem to overstay their welcome. The game knows that they will be back later and moves you onto the next place relatively quickly. And the island structure that it has going on I find to actually be advantageous, because there is enough to each one that makes them stand out as unique without so much that you start getting bored. In many ways, it feels like Paper Mario Color Splash to me, and I actually mean that as a compliment. That game's level structure allowed the game to naturally switch between multiple different atmospheres and ideas, and the game had plenty of different ideas to share with you. Brothership has the added bonus of having an enjoyable battle system on top of it all. So what we have here in my mind is an opportunity to reap the benefits of Color Splash without having all the negative that comes attached to it. Before you know it, Brothership has you attached to a solid cast of characters, and after connecting some islands to Shipshape Island, the hub of the game, or the Brothership if you will, the residents you meet from the island start coming and going and impact the story. It actually does feel real in a sense, because it makes your visiting of other islands not feel like it was just to advance the story. You often see tangible effects as a result of where you've been, and early game characters can often come into play later on. Some of these characters will become vendors on the island for you, some will assist you in some side quests, whereas others like Connie, the first person that you meet in the hub world, can always seem to be found in a different place. I've noticed that every character in this game that has a specific name, I always seem to remember, and I think that there is something to say about that. So despite what some describe as a slow start, I will say the following. In just a few hours, the game gives you more notable companions and unique locations than really all of Paper Jam combined, and this is not something that really slows down. There are interesting ideas and story elements all throughout, and many moments that made me smile, and this is what the game invests its time into as opposed to random Toad hide-and-seek quest. And I will say, it's a relief to say that, even if it's a low bar to clear. There are pacing issues at times. Because the game takes place on a big ship, there's a Wind Waker element where your location on a large map does matter a little bit, and it can even cause some waiting to happen in the early game. Luckily, you get that swift sail type of upgrade that makes the process much faster pretty early in the game, so it's largely not an issue. But despite these moments where things can drag, what is important to remember is that the game has a purpose. It does have its own charm, and it is not afraid to be unique and even different. A lot of the drag can simply come from the frequent side quests that the game offers as well. But the thing is, I found myself wanting to do all of them, and even looking forward to a few of them. This is again because the game did successfully get me to care about the world of Concordia and its cast of characters. So if you are a Mario and Luigi fan who has held out to this point, I will say that I think you will ultimately enjoy this game for what it is. It will not be without flaws, of course, and it is a relatively long game as well. But to those of you who were worried about it being just like Paper Jam, which kind of was me, I can say that this is not really the case at all, and that is because the game has its its own identity. But to further clarify on that, it's about time we get into some moderate spoilers. So every Mario and Luigi game seems to have its own theme. Superstar Saga kicked this off with being a game about stolen voices and laughter, and after this, the theme started infiltrating the titles of the games themselves. Time travel, inside stories, and dreams all made for some interesting themes, and one might question when looking at Brothership's title, what the theme actually is again. Well, it is perhaps the most fitting one for this series to begin with, and that of course is a theme of connection. You pilot a ship that seeks to rebuild the kingdom of Concordia with the help of Connie and Snoutlet. All the characters look like outlets, and electricity is kind of a big theme here. Honestly, it's something that anyone could pick up on when looking at the trailers, but again, I tried not to think about it too much until I actually started playing. The reason why I say it's the perfect Mario and Luigi theme though is because the series is about connection to begin with. The brothers are a dynamic duo who are clearly greater than the sum of their parts, as evidenced by all their ridiculous bros attack memes. Much to my dismay over the years, every new Nintendo game feels like it has to have a gimmick somewhere, and I will say that this gimmick didn't get in the way and perhaps actually made the game better. The game introduces a new status effect titled Gloam. This word I had no idea how to pronounce at first, but again, this game is electricity themed and it rhymes with ohm, so I'm pretty confident on this pronunciation now. But anyways, the focus of this status isn't to do damage to you or prevent you from taking your turn, it's to prevent you from working together and executing bros attacks. Gloam has a story effect on characters in this game, and its purpose is to sever connections. It makes for a great status in my opinion. It is a meaningful yet sensible nerf when considering the game's themes, and it is not super annoying like some kind of dizzy status that prevents you from acting to begin with. But it is definitely a setback in select fights especially, and even if you were to just heal it, it takes a turn away that could have been a big bros attack. They did really well with this status, as it's a seamless fit that only emphasizes the importance of dodging, which I think has always been this series' distinction and even strength when it comes to its battles. The enemy attacks are often the selling point of battles in the Mario and Luigi series. They can be difficult to learn and provide way more variety than even the bros attacks in how you play the game. Many of these dodges and counterattacks are extremely rewarding to pull off, and I think that this game has a lot of really good enemy attacks, especially later in the game as you start fighting more advanced enemies that, believe it or not, can also be more than the sum of their parts. Status effects are not going to be in every fight of course, but one thing will be: the new battle gimmick. And this comes in the form of battle plugs, which I find to be a very fine replacement to the badge systems of some of the recent games in the series. I even preferred it in many ways. Battle plugs are one of the many features in this game that you really wish were introduced earlier than when it is, but the game is long enough to make good use of it still at least. But pretty much these plugs give you some immediate perks in battles. These perks will only activate a set amount of times, and you have to choose which ones to activate with limited selections you can make at any one time. After you use a plug enough, it'll run out of charge and you will have to recharge it over a set amount of turns. It's a cool system that can justify some pretty challenging battles in the late game, solely because you have access to so many potential buffs, and I love that aspect of it. And because of this, the potential for challenge runs that don't use the plugs has extra potential as well, because the game seems to be designed around this system to some degree. Now, the game itself does have its own set of challenges on one of the menus that gives you some rewards as you complete them. I did pay attention to them and focused on completing them during the main story, but I have some regrets about focusing on them, to be honest. If you haven't played the game yet, I strongly urge you to ignore the challenge board entirely, because I felt like it actually set up some expectations within myself that changed how I viewed the game and its story. I would say it can even spoil you in some ways too as you progress. Chances are you're going to beat a lot of the challenges and claim many of the rewards naturally anyway, especially if you have a balanced approach to the game that explores everything you can do. And I don't think that any of the rewards are so great that you need to specifically target them either. But going back to battle plugs, I would say that the only gripe I have of the battle plug system is that using them in the middle of the game can feel unsatisfying at times. Like, you know that feeling you get as an RPG player where you never want to use an item because you might want to have it for later, even if the situation you're currently in would be a completely reasonable time to use it? Well, I feel that with the battle plug system. Because you have to use a plug entirely in order to recharge it back to the maximum, I constantly found myself not always wanting to use these plugs just in case I reached an important fight where I wanted to have certain plugs maxed out and available. I think what I would have preferred is if there were limited charging slots, but with the trade-off that the game would allow you to charge anything you wanted to at any time, even if a plug wasn't at 0%. I understand that the drawback of the system would be more manual use, and perhaps it would be less intuitive in this way. But I think even having the option to run the system this way wouldn't have hurt anything, in the same way that having an option to control Luigi like in the earlier games would have been nice to have as well. Speaking of Luigi, he is treated so much better in this game. This really should be a factor that goes without saying, but the series had kind of developed a bad habit of just trashing him ruthlessly for almost zero reason, and in Brothership that doesn't go entirely away, and that's fine really. Luigi's a clumsy dude, and he has moments where the game clearly pokes some fun at him for it, but at the same time the game also gives him quite a few victories as well. And this is often done through Luigi becoming a man of many ideas, but also just in how other characters react to him. Snoutlet is significantly more respectful towards Luigi after Starlo was a downright bully in Paper Jam, and honestly it goes a long way in perhaps my preference for Snoutlet over Starlo. He feels more like a companion than a chaperone, and I think that vibe is for the better. Now, some of the areas in the game are definitely better than others. I was not a big fan of the lighthouse levels personally. Even if they were designed to be dungeons in a sense, the stark contrast from the variety that the rest of the game provides does stick out. Every island having a pretty distinct theme does have a downside too though, because it feels like the NPCs of these places take on the personality of their area a little bit too much. If an NPC is wearing a suit for instance, you already know that they just can't wait to tell you about how busy they are. Because the game's story takes place in a disconnected land, a lot of characters mention that they're from other parts of the world, but got stuck on the island you find them on. This ordinarily would feel like a cool way to make the world feel more real, but ultimately it feels like a half step. This is because you do link the islands back together, and it doesn't really result in the NPCs moving around that much. Many of them talk about their families on other islands, but stay dormant once the opportunity to go see them returns, outside of a handful of side quests where that is the entire point. I understand that this is probably just extra work, and the devs were even meticulous in giving a lot of these characters some dialogue that explains why they haven't left a place even, but it still comes across as a little unbelievable. If there's anything that the earlier parts of the game do better than the end, I would say that the areas and enemies often feel more distinct. A lot of early game music really stands out in my opinion, even comparatively to the latter parts of the game, and a matter of fact, it felt like the early game was frequently introducing new enemy types, while the later parts of the game were more content to really invest in some specific ideas and archetypes. Now I will say the following. The enemies that recur the most are good enemies, and they constantly throw some new twist at you using these enemies as the game goes on. A lot of these enemies can be easily categorized though, and it makes me question one thing. And that's why there aren't more battle themes than there are. The main battle theme, while being one that really grew on me, is excessively overworked in my mind, especially given the runtime of the game. But especially in a time where we're coming off a TTYD remake where every single boss has a unique theme, and where every area in the game switches up the main battle theme as well, it's hard not to think about this. I think over to games like Pokemon and even Bug Fables, where there's a specific enemy team that has its own special battle theme, and these songs became some of the biggest hits in the entire game. This idea would have undoubtedly worked wonders in spicing up the battle theme variety in this game, and not just boss battles, but regular battles as well. And trust me, what we got was pretty good in many ways. I'm a huge fan of the mini-boss theme in this game, and it feels right at home amongst the pantheon of legendary mini-boss themes the series has provided in the past. And of course, it has that one part. I feel like every time I hear these kinds of sections and these boss themes, I kind of just go, yeah, I got another loop in me. And that's exactly what a good boss theme needs to be. And to a degree, I feel it in the regular battle theme too. It is one of those battle themes that almost feels like it's trying too hard to be a JRPG battle theme when you first hear it. But as the game progresses, you just start to feel like, yeah, it's the perfect fit for what it is. And that's great. But it's 2024 now, and it's just not enough in my mind. There just needs to be more. But anyways, let's get into the specifics now. It's time for heavy spoilers, and I'll give everyone a few seconds to exit out if they aren't ready for this part. And I'm about to talk about some good stuff and some bad stuff. If you want to experience it on your own, this is your last chance. Alright, on we go. I really love what they did with Bowser in this game. His minions are known for being simple enemies, and the twist of them being later game enemies here not only allowed for the early game enemies to have all new attacks, but allowed for the minions themselves to shine a bit. The Hammer Bro variants in particular stood out, but even the Koopas and Goombas show out a bit. The Shy Guys and their idle animations are so goofy, and they even brought back a Shy Guy Says attack back into the series. But I think what really puts things into perspective here is that the orange Magic Koopas casually use a move that feels like a direct reference to a final boss move from Superstar Saga, and I find that really cool. By the way, I wasn't sure what to expect on the reference front now that the game isn't being made directly by Alpha Dream, but they hit that fine line of just enough but not too many to the point where it feels like they are desperately trying to nostalgia pander. Of course, you have a few returning enemies like Capnaps and these Fire and Ice enemies from Dream Team, even if I thought the latter were reserved for, well, Luigi's dreams. But you also have these crowed enemies that look like a mechanical version of the Treevils from Bowser's Inside Story. Shark Bones return from Superstar Saga and almost carry a mythical status to them where you're supposed to avoid them when you first encounter them. And of course, you also have some returning Bros attacks like the Jump Helmet and Yu-Wu Cannon from Inside Story, alongside the Bomb Derby from Dream Team and Paper Jam. In case you felt like they were giving Partners in Time the cold shoulder, the Bros Ball field move returns from that game for the first time ever, I believe, and no, we're not counting the bouncing Dream Team variant, and it's one of the more fun field moves to use if I'm being honest as well. Of course, the side quests also love acknowledging the past games as long as those past games have enough unique elements to them to really acknowledge, and you see this in the Reefs, but also in a special side quest involving Starlo that you won't want to miss. Overall, there was a lot here, but never so much that it felt out of place. But going back to Bowser and his minions, it should be noted that they kinda act as they do out of a brewing rivalry between them and Zocket's own troops, the main villain for most of the game. Zocket's troops are another group of enemies that I think are probably overused, but extremely well done as well. They are fun to fight and make for an interesting dynamic when it comes to the relationship between the player and Bowser's own army. Bowser is so preoccupied in this game that he doesn't even kidnap Peach, which is kind of a welcome surprise. I enjoyed that they could make Peach just a supporting character and part of Ship-Shape Island's budding culture, and I feel like that would have been ruined if they let the normal series tropes take over. Really, this game handles Bowser, Peach, and Luigi all in spectacular form. Like I alluded to earlier, I wish both Bowser's minions and Zocket's troops had special battle themes, or at the very least variants of the main battle theme, because I feel like it would have given the game a lot of life in its later chapters as you start fighting them excessively. But what perhaps is the greatest crime is that neither of these groups really gets a proper send-off in my mind. So, question, where is the Bowser boss battle theme? Like, seriously, where is it? I mean, I know he's not the final boss, and I'm genuinely happy that he wasn't involved in the final fight for once. I'm glad he could take part in the ending scenes in a way that was not disruptive to the game's plot, even if I have no idea what actually happened to him immediately after his grand appearance in one of the final cutscenes before the final fight. One of the best fights in series history for me is the Bowser and Baby Bowser face-off that you have like 75% of the way through Partners in Time. That game took the gimmick of the game and threw it right back in your face, and had a really cool theme attached to it that encapsulated both Bowser and his baby variant's personalities. Partners in Time understood the assignment, and I can't say that Brothership did in this regard. And it didn't even stop there. The Extension Corps, a group they hyped up literally all game, didn't get a unique boss theme either, and this might be the only game they're ever in. Weirdly, we didn't even get one-off battles with X or Shun as well, but it doesn't even stop there. Not even Zocket himself got a special boss theme, and I just found that to be absolutely sickening. Like, what are we doing here? Look, I know it was pretty obvious that Zocket wasn't the final boss, music concerns aside, but to just pack it in and not act like a finale in any way whatsoever, in my opinion, undermines the whole Reclusa setup to begin with. I know that many people trashed the Inside Story remake, but one thing it actually did better than the original game was include some new in-game battle themes. When Mario and Luigi fight the Dark Star now no longer does the regular boss theme play, it's a specialized theme for the moment. The player does not yet know about the Dark Bowser plot that happens after, and this can actually result in a player questioning the greater significance of the regular Dark Star battle. Even if there are story elements left unsolved, I think making the player question if any fight could result in the ending of the game is an effective way to keep suspense high. The Zocket fight is less effective than it otherwise could have been because the player feels like there's no true potential for it to be the final fight. The cutscene following the fight loses its impact because us gamers know the rules of games. They are programmed to be a specific way. If a game is going to take a surprising twist, we need to be left in the dark about certain things, and even if there is foreshadowing, at least leave it ambiguous. I really wish the Great Conductor didn't spoil Zocket's true identity. I know it's not a spoiler because the game literally tells you it, but I don't think that the game had to do it at that time, nor do I think it should have. It's not like it wasn't somewhat predictable, but it could have been left up to Fury and made the actual reveal after the fight that much more impactful and exciting for those who actually got the prediction right. And on top of it all, the challenge board that I referred to earlier also does not help in this regard. When I am approaching a final battle type of atmosphere, and I have two very blatantly missing bros move challenges that just say, advance the story to unlock, I know that the story can't be over. In my opinion, they completely botched this section of the game, and they really didn't have to. Now, in my opinion, Reclusa did so much with so little screen time. They were honestly a really fun villain, and I think they deserved better from their game. The thing is, this type of character was never going to be a character that was nothing more than a final boss. You couldn't use Reclusa in the same way that Bowser's Inside Story used the Dark Star. One final area just simply wasn't enough for a character with this type of personality to shine. Reclusa needed to take over Concordia for their whole shtick to work. It was necessary to show what the actual goal was, and the Flower Trap simulations were a huge part in making Reclusa memorable to begin with. The Mushroom Kingdom sequence that you go through in the middle of the final dungeon was genuinely one of my favorite parts of any game I've played, and a big part of this was just that it was so unexpected. It wasn't unexpected in that it happens to you after it happens to a lot of the other characters in the game, but when I picked up this game from the store, I was just hoping that the gameplay would be good enough and that the game would give me something memorable to hold on to, whether that be through a good character, funny moment, any of that. This was unlike anything I possibly could have imagined in a game that was technically a follow-up to Paper Jam. It's not like this sequence is meant to fool the player or anything. Obviously, something is wrong, and watching the world start to deteriorate and glitch out as the bros begin to piece things together is fun. The reveal that the bros have been ambushed by Reclusa's flower simulations was not necessarily the surprise, but still a twist that you weren't really expecting to see in the final dungeon. I mean, you're the main character after all. This was never going to happen to the essential workers of Shipshape Island. You need a shopkeep, you need all the people that are offering side quests to still be able to finish those side quests in this part of the game. And it especially wasn't going to happen to you because you're the player character. The game requires you to have some level of plot armor. So when it does, you feel it a bit. The scene where the bros enter the castle and Peach asks them where they're going has a crazy intensity to it. I was genuinely expecting some kind of jump scare in the moment because of how unsettling it truly was, and I imagine a lot of the younger audience playing this game are going to experience the first time they've ever been truly scared in a video game before, which would actually make them a lot like me in a sense, someone who admittedly struggled with the shrooms at one point in my life. Perhaps this experience will not be so welcome to everyone as such, but I will say one thing. It was absolutely memorable, and when I think of this game now, I immediately think about Reclusa and this simulation, and not every game has some standout moment, I'll just say that. The little details with Reclusa are so fun. The One and Lonely moniker he assigns himself is so corny that you can't help but just kinda smile along. Defeating the Weeping Troopers results in an explosion that reveals some of the Zoc troopers you've fought against throughout the entire game. But when they're revealed, instead of fighting you, they flee the scene and sometimes even throw a mushroom over at you, perhaps to thank you for freeing them. And if you exit out to the main menu during this phase of the game and leave it running for a bit, you might be greeted in a surprising little manner. And I love the little details like this. But there's unfortunately a problem with all of this, and it's something I've picked up on when talking to other people about the game who have finished it. And it's that by the time you get to all this fun stuff, a lot of the players seem to just be tired and beat down and are kind of waiting on the game to finish. Consider the ending of Pokemon Black and White 1 if you've played it. There's a similar feeling of unresolved storylines when you enter the Elite Four challenge here, much like when you enter Fortress Zocket for the first time. The villainous team of the game is still very much out there, and you have to wonder if the story is going to be resolved after you become the league champion. For your challenge to end up uprooted by your rival himself, well, that changes everything. It's not that the game added additional content onto your plate, it's that they replaced what is conventional with something fresh. If you signed up for the end of the game here, you were still getting it. It was just likely not the ending you expected and one where expectations were truly subverted. In Brothership, you enter what feels like the final dungeon 3 different times with hours-long stops in between. You feel like you reached the climax multiple times just to find out that you still aren't even that close to the game ending yet. And I've found that many players have just been frustrated wishing it could end because the game is already pretty long up to this point and then it throws essentially 10 more hours on you. I think we've all had those nights where you're like, I'm in the final trek of this game, let's just finish it up tonight. You mentally prepare yourself to get to the end, even if it keeps you up a bit later than you should be. But the thing is, if you do this with Brothership, you will ultimately be going to bed super late, unfinished, and with not a ton of story payoff. The game kinda prepares you for the end, and then just throws a bunch more on top of you that is not that ending. It's not that the content that the game throws at you is bad, to be honest. The final islands are all really unique actually. Being an outlaw in Bowser's newly acquired turf is fun. The return to Conductor Island is very cool, and I love what Jellyfish Island is all about, to be honest. But I don't think all of this stuff was truly appreciated because there were multiple fake outs. And don't get me wrong, a fake out is not necessarily a bad thing, but the game resets after them. It's not that you just get kicked from Fortress Zakat, it's that a barrier is built around it and that you know you will not be getting back in for a bit of time. It's not that Reclusa isn't an interesting twist, it's that the game now throws a giant fetch quest upon you when you were expecting the end to be near. In Dream Team and Superstar Saga, the Ulta Bed and Beanstar fetch quests could be considered padding, but they were used slightly differently. They took you back to previous places and often showed you the new parts of existing areas, and it was so you could access a new place in the story entirely. In Bowser's Inside Story, collecting the Star Cures opens the gate to the final dungeon, and once you're in, you're actually in. In Brothership, collecting all the bonds is supposed to feel powerful, and the potential was truly there. I love that they included moments with the people that are supposed to be considered villains. I love the dynamic that Bowser Jr. and Buddy had, for instance. But the return visits you make to these areas where you collect the bonds are not exactly interesting. You're just there to seek out specific characters, often who are just waiting for you front and center. Not to unlock any new content, and it's also you can unlock a dungeon that you've literally gone through before. By the time you're almost done collecting all these bonds, you're just sitting there questioning why Mario and Luigi's own bond doesn't qualify, more than ready to just get the game over with. And when this quest is all said and done, you get to the final dungeon just to find out that there's another long section to work your way through. Like I said, the timing made this whole section of the game worse, but additionally it feels like padding because it's just the same type of cutscene over and over. In Superstar Saga, the Beanstar quest comparatively doesn't really feel like padding because the first piece is obtained in an entirely new area to begin with, and a good one at that. And for some of the other pieces, you play some mini-games and get another Popple boss fight in one of them. The only piece that makes the padding really obvious is the Yoshi Theater Bean Through quest, which makes you take a victory lap around the Bean Bean Castle town. In some ways, this section is still kind of a fun detour because a lot of these areas weren't required earlier in the game to begin with, and the theater has some neat little references within it. Bowser's Inside Story and Dream Team kind of follow suit with this strategy. Dream Team in particular introduces the battle ring to you through the Ulta Bed collection quest, which was another take on the gauntlet from Inside Story. And that brings me to the next point. Why don't we have a boss rush or a mad skill-a-thon for bros moves in this game? Even Paper Jam managed to have some extra content like this, so it does feel like a strange omission. It's not that the game doesn't have refights. A lot of bosses are given a gloam form that make them significantly more challenging, and these rematches, while usually done through side quests, are pretty fun. But they're also just one-time events as far as I'm aware. In my opinion, there's no excuse not to have a boss rematch system in 2024 for any game really, but it is a bit more disappointing here since this series had become pretty good at including this feature in the past. If you like a fight, you shouldn't have to replay an entire game to get to it, and honestly it's a bummer too because a boss gauntlet would have had so much potential with the battle plug system in my opinion. Can we get some DLC maybe? Furthermore, I'm kinda sad that there isn't some late game event that restores the state of Concordia before the true final battle. I kinda hate doing the side quest late in the game with the land in a permanently screwed state. I mean, I understand why it must be this way, the story demands it, and the payoff is worth it certainly, but much like how you need a new save file to fight certain bosses, the situation makes you need a new save file to simply access the rest of the game's soundtrack again. Everything has been replaced with the gloomy theme of Recluse's world, and there's no way to truly play the game after the credits either. You'll just return to the final save block when reloading the game. So with it all said, I have mixed feelings on the ending of the game clearly. There's so much I like and so much I feel could have been done better, and honestly, it's kinda true for the full game. I found myself really enjoying the gameplay loop for a while and craving more, but when it was all over and the credits finally rolled, I felt as if I had no idea where I'd rank this game amongst the other games in the series. Part of me wants to rate it pretty high, even if in some ways it might feel irrational. At the end of the day, the game doesn't have to have masterclass game design to be a product I personally enjoy after all, but I realize that I'm not really sure yet what all my thoughts are. I don't know if it's my second favorite Mario and Luigi or if it's my fifth favorite, but I do think I can at least confidently answer one particular question. Is Mario and Luigi back? Well, I do think so. I know this game wasn't perfect, but none of my issues were ideological ones. The game surprised me in a lot of good ways and I found myself caring again. All of the problems present in this game feel fixable, but most importantly, the next time there is a new Mario and Luigi game revealed, I will be optimistic. And I think that is what actually matters. Welcome back, friend.